one of the task forces that's helping psychologists and mental health professionals deal with COVID, sponsored by the American Phenomenological Association. Along with me is Dr. Eileen Serland, who is chair of the International Whole Person Approaches to Psychology. And very distinguished guests with us going to be in Dr. Serland. But first, let me introduce to you those psychologists and mental health workers who are on our call today. We've got Brittany Geddes, who you probably met because she set up our call today, and she is in Pennsylvania. We've got Dr. Giselle Gaviria, and although she has the Golden Gate Bridge in her background, she's really here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I also am in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've got Dr. Marilyn Safer, who is with us in Haifa, Israel. And we have Dr. Eleanor Partis, who is here with us in the Tel Aviv region in Israel. And we've got Dr. Patricia Villavicencio Carrillo, who is with us from Madrid. I see Amy Lee, who is also in the Bay Area, is with, I don't see her yet, which I hope she gets on in a little bit. We have a very great roundtable hour every Thursday from 12 to 1 Eastern time. And during that hour, we usually have a distinguished presenter or more than one presenter who talks to us about an important topic that we're trying to deal with as mental health workers during COVID. And we will have our presenters start us off for a little while, and then we'll talk about discussions and questions and all of. So if you're around, please do. If you're on Zoom, let us know. We can't always see you if you don't. Some people are on Zoom, but not in their face. But we also are live on Facebook right now. IPV group and on the International Whole Persons Approaches group. So those are two Facebook pages. And if you can't be here right this moment, the videos will be on the Facebook page afterwards. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Serland, who is going to introduce Dr. Foreman.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, and welcome back to the Roundtables, everybody. Our group, the International Whole Person Approaches, has been collaborating with the IPV group. We really work internationally, and we bring in all kinds of other approaches. We use the creative arts, we use the somatic therapies, mindfulness, relaxation, a lot of nonverbal therapies, so that it's been a very interesting collaboration with mostly experiential approaches that we use for working with trauma. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Will Foreman, who's calling in from Solano Prison in California. I've known Dr. Foreman since he was my student at Saybrook University many years ago. He's been in a Navy corpsman and working in the prisons for a very long time, has developed a unique approach to working in prisons. He'll talk about a phenomenological approach. He's developed a model, done some research, won a distinguished California award for his work. And he's going to tell us about his model today. And especially most of us have heard lots of stories about during COVID, what's gone on in the prisons. We really haven't had a firsthand report. So this is our chance to hear from somebody who's speaking right now from the prison system. So Dr. Foreman, thanks so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you, Eileen. Am I coming across?
Yes.
Okay, good. You know, again, I'm Will Foreman, and I do react to the name Will better than Dr. Foreman these days. In preparing this document or my presentation, I realized how complex the prison system is, and trying to reduce it to a 5-minute blurb was a daunting task. I also reviewed COVID in the prison, and Rachel, my coworker, came in and told me it was time to leave, and I realized how absolutely fatigued I felt just simply going over all the events that have transpired over the past year related to COVID. I don't think I'd felt that fatigue before, and obviously it has been there this whole time. I'm also I'm a shop steward for the union here, and early on, some of the staff members were very anxious about working here. In fact, some quit working in the prison because of COVID. And I pushed through, and we got permission to have some people work from home that felt too much anxiety to come into work every day inside the prison. Rachel and I have both missed very few days except to take a vacation day here or there, while others have worked maybe half their time or a quarter of their time from home. It's not easy to do. We need to see our patients face to face. They don't, if some prisons, they've been able to work at a distance, but then you have a psych tech or other staff member that has to sit with the inmate while you're talking with them from home over video conference. And I don't think that's fair to the other staff member. We just prefer to be in person. As Eileen mentioned, I was a Navy corpsman, so I've actually been involved in public health since I was 19 years old. Briefly there in San Diego, I worked in a research project where we studied and treated spinal meningitis during an epidemic in the Navy and Marine Corps boot camp. And as I said in my little introduction there, I've been waiting for this pandemic for 50 years. Nothing has surprised me about it except our government's reaction to it, or lack thereof reaction to it. And I think that's certainly part of the stress of the last year, was all the turmoil that was created in Washington. So my expectations of how to respond to COVID was informed by public health, which also is the basis for community psychology, which is what in part I brought to the prison. Was I looked at the prison as an ecology system that has resources and that has need of resources, and started trying to understand how I could best serve the population here. One way I serve them is I call them patients. Officially, I should call them inmate patients. According to my profession, I should call them clients or participants or something like that. I want it clear they're my patients. And if I'm having issues with custody that relates to a mental health issue with one of my patients, I'm very clear why I'm talking to custody. And I get pretty good respect for that. Also, I don't back down easy, so that's well known. I've got 3 different areas I want to talk about. And in part, I'm approaching this from a hermeneutic perspective, just as I did as a community psychology perspective when I entered the prison system. One thing to understand about California prison system, which is probably shared in most large-scale bureaucracies, is it's very top-heavy. The communication is top-down, and there's very little filtering of information back up from the frontline workers to the policymakers. I work in mental health. That comes under medical services, and we have a CEO who is equal to the warden at our prison. That's fine. You can leave that slide on for a moment. However, our instructions don't come from the CEO at our prison. The instructions come from Sacramento through our chief psychologist and chief of mental health. The CEO really kind of coordinates mental health orders and policy within the medical service policy. She has no direct, is not even the hiring authority, so she has no really direct authority over us. The warden is in a similar position. The warden tries to coordinate various divisions, which all take their orders from Sacramento. So I'm not going to go too much more into that, except for mental health and custody to reach a common decision maker, we literally have to go to the secretary of the department, the very top person, before there's a common decision maker. So much in Sacramento is being made by committee. When I started in the prison system in 2007, the inspector general discovered that the psychiatrist at Salinas Valley couldn't be found. Couldn't call and reach him. And eventually the inspector general's investigators found that he was working full-time at a private psychiatric hospital in the community while collecting full-time pay in CDCR. And he had been doing it for 10 years and was literally not available to the staff for consultation or supervision. He left. He did resign with his retirement, and I don't believe ever had to pay a dime back of money that he used. Again, because of the absolute opaqueness of the bureaucracy. There's a culture in prison, also shared in lots of institutions. The inmates here wear blue, the cops wear green, and then there's free staff like me who are not supposed to wear blue, and otherwise we dress in civilian clothes. The custody looks at inmates as inmates. They're just guys in blue. Some inmates do distinguish themselves as individuals, sometimes because of the nature of their crime, sometimes because of the nature of their behavior in the prison, and other times because the guards actually kind of like them. But all inmates are looked at as being devious, manipulators, always trying to get over on you, always lying. And when free staff come into the prison system, they're given the same sort of indoctrination, which isn't so different from hospitals. Again, I was a Navy corpsman. I worked in a hospital. I know that when a 7-year-old girl came in with a severe laceration, she was a laceration. I couldn't really see her as a 7-year-old girl and be able to hurt her in treating the laceration. So I had to objectify her. Now, with that said, there's a paradox. Young rookie comes in to work in Solano, often stands with his back to the wall or her back to the wall, has very brand new creased uniform and eyes wide open, scared. One young man working as a guard was given a new assignment in the kitchen, and he told the sergeant, "I've never worked in the kitchen. I don't know what's expected of me." The sergeant said, "Well, just ask inmate so-and-so. He'll tell you exactly what you need to do." Well, ask the inmate? Yeah, no, he's worked there for a long time. He knows what cops are supposed to do in there. While later, the CO called back to the sergeant and said, "Man, I'm really confused by which keys to use for which cabinets here." The sergeant said, "Ask inmate so-and-so. He'll tell you which key." Well, we're not supposed to tell him what the key numbers are. Oh, he's worked there a long time. He knows what the key numbers are. So what we're trained to do and what we actually do can really be dipolar opposites from one another. I work at a level 3 prison. The top level is level 4. Now, imagine everything you've ever experienced in movies and TV about prisons. It's nothing like that. Guys every day have school books, they go to jobs, they go to their medical appointments, their mental health appointments, they go to classes, they go to groups. And any day, anytime, in a heartbeat, it can be exactly like you think prisons are. One thing we've had with COVID is we've had buildings locked down. We've only let 1/3 of a cell block out at one time to the yard. Now, last week, we started letting 2 buildings out together, and immediately we had a stabbing. We had another stabbing this week that I've heard of. We may have had several others I haven't heard of. We haven't had the inmate on inmate violence under COVID like we have now that we're starting to come out of the precautions of COVID. There's prison gangs. Prison gangs perpetuate violence. They also prevent violence. Again, another paradox. Without the prison gangs, every inmate would be on his own and would be doing what he does when he's home on the streets. They still do that, but they're regimented much more so by the prison gang, because the prison gang doesn't want violence unless there's somebody they want to quote unquote discipline. We call it cleaning house, which may mean a death, which may mean murder. Some of these things I really don't like telling people who don't work in the prisons. It's why I didn't invite anybody to come to, because I don't talk to my friends much about prison. At the same time, the gangs run a thriving drug business, and if there's violence and there's a lockdown, they don't make money. It's as simple as that. That's another thing under COVID. Before COVID, custody kept telling us that visitors brought the drugs, most of the drugs and cell phones in. Those are both all contraband, as well as tobacco. There's more drugs in prison right now, this prison, and there's more cell phones in this prison than there ever was when we had visitors. Visitors were stopped in February of 2020 and have only started up about 2 weeks ago, 2 weekends ago. As far as rehabilitation, there's incentives to rehabilitate, and then there's motivations to rehabilitate. Incentive is you take a class, you're more likely to parole. Motivation is you want this class so that you can go out and not come back again. And again, people are forced into these classes, so you may have more people that have an incentive to complete the class but not learn anything than you have people motivated to really learn something, to try to benefit from it. We had again, an Inspector General report in 2017 that looked at substance abuse treatment and recidivism, return to prison. And the Inspector General found, incidentally, California Inspector General is a totally independent agency. They can't be fired or demoted for a 10-year term without some serious ethical lapse or legal lapse. In 2017, they looked at this and they found that after 2 years on parole, there was a 24% recidivism rate for people who had gone through the substance abuse treatment program without receiving any CBT. And they compared that to inmates who had completed the SAP program with receiving CBT. And they found after 2 years, there was a 25% recidivism rate, virtually no difference. The new SAP program now, it's been remodeled a bit, and they don't say cognitive behavioral therapy, they say cognitive behavioral intervention, because in truth, it's not therapy. They teach CBT principles. There's discussion about CBT principles, but it's not, certainly like as an existentialist and trauma psychologist, it's not anything I would call therapy. In fact, the vendor for its website says that it's so well written that the modules can be taught by a correctional officer with no other training. I'm not going to quite go into my own program yet, but my program is much different than that. COVID we became aware of COVID certainly in February. I think I was aware of it in late January. Again, I've been waiting for this pandemic for 50 years, and SARS I thought would be, and there's been others I've tracked thinking that would be the pandemic that, like the one I experienced in San Diego in the early 70s. Can you still see me? Okay, my computer just wanted to turn off on me. COVID started to have an increase in incidence in Chino at the California Institute for Men in April. And the prison law office sued CDCR, which is a very quick lawsuit. They live at San Quentin. They're basically their office is at San Quentin. They have a pipeline to file lawsuits. No doubt went through the receiver, insisting that CDCR needed to move inmates from Chino to spread it out so that there was social distancing, so that they would be less likely to spread the virus amongst one another. So Sacramento signed off on a plan. The judge signed off on it. Health services told their people at Chino to test inmates that on the list that was given by custody for possible transfer, which they did. Custody was told to transfer inmates who were on that list that tested negative. Custody did. There was no coordination at Chino about the movement of these inmates, where they were housed while they were waiting for transport. Some of them had been had tested negative 3 and 4 weeks before they were transferred, in which time they were exposed to COVID. Now, the inmates I've talked to here oftentimes thought that it was CDCR trying to undermine social justice reforms, trying to kill off inmates. And honestly, it was one hand not knowing what the other was doing in CDCR. It's like Shiva. There's 6 hands and none of them know what the other 5 hands are doing. 121 were transferred to San Quentin. You read about this. I think it was May 30th, 121 were transferred. June 2nd, they found that 16 of them had tested positive for COVID. Well, when they arrived on the 30th, they were placed in North Block and East Block. North Block is 5-tier high open cell living. And there's this huge open space in front of the cells. So when you have bars in front of the cells, you go to the next slide. When you have bars in front of the cells, people yell, people sing, people cough and sneeze. Go on. Next one. Yeah, that's it. This is the incident rate in CDCR. The second bump there is largely driven, it's not very big. The second bump there is largely driven by the 1,454 positive inmates who tested positive at San Quentin on the 15th of June, 2 weeks after they arrived from, May, after they arrived from Chino. Again, the open cells just allowed the virus to spread. Guys I've met recently that lived through that time at San Quentin were terrified. The cops were terrified. There was a lot of people on edge. There was, if the officers are irritated, on edge, scared, they may overreact to inmates, which is a lot of what I've heard. Incidents of that, not necessarily there's a lot of incidents of that, but there certainly were incidents of cops clearly being on edge. We really didn't get a spike in the CDCR until you see there in January. The bottom graph is the prison I work at. we had 4 cases at two different points in time of positive COVID tests until January, and you can see our spike there. Up until then, the inmates were fairly relaxed and reasonably comfortable being locked in their cells. My yard is a level 3 yard. Go ahead to the next slide. No, I don't know why. I want the slide that shows the cop looking in the cell door. I think you need to go back. I don't know why I didn't see it. It's a photograph. Go back further.
No,
Go
I
back one
don't
more.
see that. I don't see that on the, it's blank.
Oh, somehow the photographs didn't. That's too bad. Okay. I work on the level 3 yard. We have solid doors. So when an inmate's locked in the cell, they're much less likely to be exposed to viruses. The image that I had hoped you'd see would be a row of cell doors. You and I, living in a cell, would find it extremely uncomfortable. Yeah, it was a slide right after the picture of the prison. So I don't know why it's not there, but it's not there. You can leave it on the graph. Sorry about that diversion. These guys live in the cells all the time. In fact, quite a few of them are more comfortable living in a cell than they are living outside of a cell. Another picture I had was a picture of what dorm living is like, which is our level 2 yard. There you have 200 men living in bunks in an open building with few walls and no cell doors. Some it's just one level, one big floor. In other of our buildings, in 2 of the buildings, in 4 of the buildings on a yard, it would have 2 tiers, and they'd be broken up into 10-man units. The guys in the cell didn't want to leave the cell. They felt much safer keeping their hygiene up, wearing masks, and living in their cell rather than moving to a dorm. The guys in the dorm felt safe living in the dorm they lived in because they knew who they lived with, they knew each other, and they felt that they'd been safe this far, they would stay safe longer if they stayed in the dorm they were in. Well, indeed, in January, when we had our spike, it was largely on level 2 in dorm living, where guys are in the same room, in the same building, spreading the virus to one another. We had relatively few at our level 3 yard, and the officers, every once in a while, were told to move people to level 2 that belonged on level 2, so we could bring people with medical conditions that made them vulnerable to COVID, bring them up from level 2 to level 3 so that they would be more protected in cell living, especially people using CPAP machines because they have emphysema or sleep apnea. Inmates in prison tend to be 10 years older medically than their chronological age. Very common is diabetes, emphysema, intestinal irritable bowel syndrome, other conditions like that. The combination is lethal when it comes to COVID. The inmates were really more concerned about their families. Families were living, again, almost like the inmates in lockdown, only in their homes, not able to socialize, not able to go to work, concerned about their finances. So a lot of the angst that the inmates had themselves about where they were living were really projected out, I think, more so than just their empathy for their families. Their fears of their own safety, I think, were put out onto their families. That's at least what my patients and I would come to an agreement on oftentimes. A typical response from one of my patients was, I'm in prison. I'm likely to die in prison. So what's it matter? It's just another day. Another common refrain you hear in prison is, it'll just last a minute. How long you been in prison? I've been in prison a minute. Now, for those of us in the Bay Area that live in one part of the Bay Area and work in another and have a really full life, our minute does not have any relationship to someone's minute who is serving a life without the possibility of parole sentence or serving a 25-year to life sentence. Indeed, even serving a 7 to life sentence. I have inmates that have been in prison since the mid-70s, serving 7 years to life. They've had multiple parole board hearings, almost no offenses in 20 years. They can't present themselves in a way that the parole board believes that they will make it when they're released from prison without coming back to prison. There's a disconnect there that I hope criminal justice reform does speak to someday. I also see people with post-COVID syndrome. One example, I was given a consultation down in one of the dorms to meet a man, 56-year-old African-American male who had had COVID, had been released from our treatment center back to dorm living about 3 days earlier. And fairly quickly, the med nurse put a consult in. He's confused about taking medication, is what the consult said. I went to meet with him. One of our new psychologists came with me. We sat down in the dorm at a table. He sat across from me. I said, "Hi, I'm Dr. Foreman. What's your name?" He said, "I wish people wouldn't ask me that. I don't know." He honestly did not know his name. He was taking the same medication. There's certain medication that the inmates can have control of. They have the pill bottle, get a new pill bottle every 30 days, and they take their medication as prescribed each day. He couldn't follow the directions on the pill bottle, even though he had done fine doing it prior to having COVID. I asked him to do serial sevens, subtract 7 from 100. And he just looked at me. Honestly, in his face, I believe he knew the word, the right answer was 93, but he couldn't find the word for it. I asked him if there's people helping him get by each day, reminding him when it was time to eat, when it was time to shower. He said, "Oh yeah, there's 4 or 5 guys helping me." I said, "You're a black guy. Are they all black?" He said, 4 are. One of them is Mexican. I said, "You've been in prison." He didn't know how long he'd been in prison, which is something all inmates know. I said, you know these guys from other prisons?" "Oh yeah, I've known them from other prisons." "And you trust them?" Yeah, I trust them." "What's one of their names?" "I don't know." So this is startling to me to see this kind of cognitive deficit. 3 weeks later, not much improvement, some. The cops in the building weren't wearing their protective personal equipment, their PPEs. After I spoke to him, I went up to the cops and I said, "You guys are really stupid not to wear those things. That's what this looks like if you catch COVID." And I walked back to talk to the inmate. When I came back, they all had their PPEs on. So I'm happy to start taking questions about COVID after I finish talking briefly about the program that I developed here that Eileen mentioned. It's called Personal Transformation, Emerging Integrity in a Prison Population. I developed it by listening to the inmates and what they told me they needed. The parole board wanted them to have insight. We don't offer insight therapy. What we offer is case management. I can do my job and get paid my full salary for meeting inmates every 90 days for 20 minutes, and that's it. Nothing more than that. That's all that's expected. I work here because of a Coleman versus state of California, whoever the governor was at the time, lawsuit filed in 1994, and it mandates case management. It does not mandate therapy. It alludes to liking the idea of having group therapy, but really doesn't define it or require it. So Sacramento only wants to meet the letter of the law so we can retire this lawsuit and have it off of our backs. We are not staffed to provide therapy. We have caseloads of up to 100. There have been people with caseloads of 180. You obviously can't do much therapy when you have a caseload of 100, let alone a caseload of 180. I was hired specifically to develop group therapy at the first prison I worked at. Then I transferred here to Solano with the same agreement. So in 2008, when I started here, by the end of 2008, I'd started my first group. And it developed and was fleshed out really through phenomenological inquiry, psychological phenomenological inquiry, which I learned from Amadeo Giorgi at Saybrook. We were looking for essence within a paradox. The paradox is, as a young child, I got a false sense of self that I'm afraid I'm this, but I know I'm not this. And there's a whole variety of different words that the 3, 4, and 5-year-old grabbed a hold of to explain this false sense of self, which in my understanding really comes from neglect and abuse in infancy and toddlerhood. That's the false self that Bowlby talks about. I'm looking at the false sense of self, which is when that got a name. Punk, bitch, trash, clown, or some of the words. There's also words in Vietnamese, Cantonese, Spanish. One guy in Spanish, his mother called him in Spanish, and I'm not going to try to remember the Spanish words right now, but son of a fucking mother whore. His mother used those terms for him, which of course reflects back on her sense of self. He treated women terribly, not surprisingly. He's been in the group therapy, and he's come to his own insight into that. He's recognized how he's looked at women and started really becoming a really wonderful kind of guy, which surprised us. I love having the guys in the group that surprise us. Right now we're in the group. It's been broken up by hiatuses of months, long hiatuses, because we couldn't bring the group together. We couldn't even bring people from the same building together for most of the last year. Right now we've broken the group up, which had been 16 people. Rachel and I run it together. We broke it up by building. And we have one building where there's 5 inmates that come in, our patients, our participants in the group. Yeah, that's a good slide there. We've gotten to the place where we have them select sets of adjectives. Words I would use to describe me to another person, words I would use to describe me to me. Now there are 2 columns, words I like, words I dislike. Another section is words a woman who knows me well might use to describe me. And I asked him to think of an older sister, an older cousin, someone who'd really tell him exactly what she thought. And most every guy has some woman that would tell him exactly what she thinks. It's a projection. They're supposed to imagine what this woman would say. And then there's a box set up like Johari's window. A box that is words that would not be used to describe me, words I like and words I dislike. At the end of therapy, just before we complete, during the termination sessions, they do the same table. Now we're at the place where we're comparing the 2 tables with one another. They're startled by what they're telling themselves about themselves by the words they chose. They're startled by the words that they dislike, and my insisting that they find some strength, something positive in a word they disliked. I gave a presentation in 2018 to Division 24, the theoretical and philosophical division. I deconstructed the word asshole. And I said, what's positive about assholeness? We had a marvelous time with it. My sense is that they have to bring together the parts of themselves that they dislike by finding something that's a strength in that they can bring into the positive and bring a union of opposites. The real challenge is the words that they said wouldn't describe them. We tell them, you chose these words so they are meaningful to you. They are saying something about you, even though they were words that you wouldn't use to describe you. The words they like are their aspirational self, the man they'd like to become, that they are becoming in the prison system itself. The words they dislike is their shadow. I'll ask them, who does that remind you of? Invariably, they say mom or they say dad. Does it remind you of you when you've done something that you later regret? Oh, yeah. Again, marvelous moment of insight. This is at the end of therapy. Up to this point, they've been stepping through their lives, drawing to my instructions in each, there's 14 panels of 6 plates about relationships throughout their lives. And we interrogate the panels with them in individual therapy is, what's the essence of your sense of self that you got from these relationships? We step through childhood, life of crime, adjudication, incarceration, and their projection of themselves into release. Now, on this slide in front of you, you can see the breakdown of the race and ethnicity of people who participated in the program in the column on the left. The column to the right is people who wanted to be in the program but weren't able to get in before they transferred or paroled. Incidentally, these are almost all self-referrals. The guys see somebody else change on the yard. They come to me and say, I want what he got. I want to change too. You can also then, in the bottom of the bottom table there is kinds of things they were convicted of. 89% violent offenses compared to 72% violent offenses. Sentence in years, 28 years versus 26 years. So the wait list and the treatment list are fairly comparable. Well, one difference you'll notice is Mexicans, Latinos are more represented in the group than they are on the wait list. And Asians are much more represented, 3 times more represented in the group than on the wait list. This is because initially every group could be 100% Black. Black guys love it. They tell each other about it. They ask to be in the group. To me, it's very important for it to be diverse, as much multiracial, multicultural as possible, because what comes out is guys start recognizing their humanness and the humanness they share with other men who they normally wouldn't speak to. So when an Asian was interested in it, they immediately got into the next group. When Hispanic was interested, they immediately got into the next group. And what that is it opens the door to more and more of those ethnicities to come into the group because word spreads. Another piece of it that's not represented here is frequently in each group, shot callers. The top dog of each of the different gangs has often been in the group. Sometimes people who were at war with each other on the street, in one gang in particular, there was a leader of the Bloods and leader of the Crips. They were lethal enemies of one another on the street. They were in the same group. I didn't know it. I didn't care. They came into the group. I was happy for them to be there. In one group session, well into group, maybe 2/3 of the way through the 30 session that we have, The two guys started talking in group about their personal histories. After group, these two guys went out onto the yard and continued the conversation. They told me later that each of them had about 20 of their gang members standing behind them, ready to start a riot at a moment's notice, while these two leaders were talking out issues and concerns and understandings that each of them had on the streets that led to them killing one another. They spent 2 hours doing that. Honestly, I almost started crying just remembering that. It was such a poignant moment. And as part of what comes out of this personal transformation is the guys start becoming different. They start operating with integrity to their true inner values. They start recognizing each other as human beings. Yeah, next slide, thank you. Just look at the bottom part of that. Rules, violations in prison, the reports there. People who went through the group in the left column, prior to entering treatment, they had lost 341 days, or 42 days, actually 343 days of good time. The violations are ranked in 6 different divisions, and each division, as you go up, you lose more good days for each division. So the lower the number, the lesser the infractions. So they were actually had lost more days than the people in the wait list. The number of RVRs were not so dissimilar, 5 rules violations compared to 4, which again will tell you that the rules violations were more serious among the people in the group. That's who I want. I want the people who are really messing up. I want people who started deviating by 3rd grade. That's who I'm looking at to be in the group, not the people doing good time. Down further is after treatment. The number of days really is fairly equivocal as far as days lost. More RVRs for the treatment group than the wait list, but the number of days lost was significantly less for the treatment group. So this also is when sentences started being reduced, people started being more likely to be released, lifers more likely to be released by the parole board. So the cops started writing more tickets. They started writing more infractions. Ignore the compass score. It doesn't make much sense to me. It's supposed to be a score showing likelihood of good behavior on parole. They're equivalent. Roughly the same number of people were released to parole. Somewhat equivalent days. Recidivism rate at the bottom of the table there, people who went through the program after 3 years on parole had an 8% recidivism rate. People on the wait list had a 25% recidivism rate, which is similar to what I described earlier with the IG report looking at people who'd completed the substance abuse program. So I think we're doing some good. Here's a slide that shows different kinds of words that people used for their false sense of self. And we can leave it there. I'm open to any questions. Sorry if I went much more than 15 minutes.
Well, I want to thank you. And just most of us don't have an idea of what goes on behind those walls. So you gave us a really thorough way to try to imagine it. And I guess it's important that we do have some times for questions now. So.
Yeah, we just have a very short period of time, but it has been fascinating. That recidivism rate, I think, is critical of all the things that you said. Will, to see that that's where it really makes so much of a difference, because that's what they have control over, is whether they go back in or again or not. Fascinating. Well, let's
Yeah.
see if anybody else has some, we'll try to be brief because we have about 8 minutes left, but we really appreciate it.
Again, I apologize for going over.
Well, that's okay. You have a lot of interesting data. I was shocked. One of the things I would say is I was shocked, given the number of Hispanics and Latinos in California and in the California prison. I've been in Chino and several of the other prisons. I'm shocked that more Hispanics did not get into the program, and wondered if it had something to do with language or just if you knew what it had to do with.
Well, I wish my Spanish was better. We do need Spanish-speaking clinicians here, and we don't have any. No, most of the Hispanics, honestly, most of them do speak very good English. The immigrants from Latin America are more likely to be challenged with English, but those that we call Southerners and those that we call Northerners typically speak good English. The Northerners sometimes don't even speak Spanish. They're prohibited from participating in mental health. I've set a certain standard that the shock collars have come to agree with, and they let their people come and see me. One of the problems is they don't want the inmate giving out intelligence information through me to custody. So they have learned to see that I respect confidentiality. We've also had their shock collars come through the group, which opened up the group. Some gangs also, the guys have to pay rent if they participate in a program. We have a therapeutic community on the yard run by Delancey Street. And for some of the ethnicities, they have to pay half of their $150 a month trust money to the shock collar so they can be in the program.
Wow.
It gets complicated.
Yeah. Yep.
Eleanor, are you trying to say something? I think you're muted.
Check that.
Yes.
You hear me?
Hello.
Hi, just a second. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, hi. Yeah, that was a really moving account, and I really appreciate that. Coming from an attachment perspective, I really was curious about the quality of prisoner and staff relationship and how your contribution is working there, because a colleague of mine in the UK and his team, they did a really 2020 research on how important that when prisoners experience a sense of genuine. I really felt that from the way the genuine empathy, positive regard, coming from a humanistic perspective. They found more post-traumatic growth and better coping with the trauma of imprisonment itself. And I thought that would be a target of your work.
Yeah, my work is well informed by attachment research and findings. The transference is absolutely noticeable. I'm an old white guy, and I think that does give me a certain white privilege. I'm a doctor foreman, so I have a PhD. That gives me a certain privilege. Rachel is a young woman. She's a LCSW, so she's Miss DeBrine to the inmates. It's amazing. They transfer mama stuff onto her. If nothing else, it's sister. Inmates frequently will say, I wish I had parents like you. Now, part of the problem with gangs on the yard is every person has brought their dysfunctional family to the prison yard. The most dysfunctional rise to the top of the hierarchy of the gangs. So it's a cacophony of dysfunction, and they train the cops to treat them like their parents treated them.
Yep.
I don't buy into that. I'm not going to treat them that way. I treat them with respect. I listen to them. I don't pretend I know what it's like to be an inmate in prison. I've worked here for 14 years. All I try to do is understand their experience of being an inmate, their experience of being a child in their family. And I really try not to presuppose. Now, if it's a Black inmate, we will talk about racism. We'll talk about the current Black Lives Matter, how that affects them, what their reactions are to it. Similarly with Hispanics, similarly with whites, honestly, and Native Americans. Native Americans are from the rural areas, live in tribal areas. Their experience isn't much different than what you imagine in the inner city. There's lots of shootings back and forth. There's lots of destruction back and forth. There's multiple layers of relationships. So no, I try to be open to the person's experience of it, which is how we come to that false sense of self, is by really interrogating their work until we derive an essence. So yeah, attachment is very important.
I just want to say, I think so that people can find you afterward, because I think some would like to contact you and ask if you've published anything. Is your email address on the slides? We'll be able to see it on Facebook or follow up, or maybe put it in the chat.
I don't think it's on the slides.
Do you want to put it in the chat right now, or I can? Shall I?
Sure. Actually, I sent it to you on an email this morning, Eileen.
Your email?
Yeah, I sent an email this morning. It's got both my emails on it. And I don't know which one would be better to send it to, honestly. They get so much email these days.
Let me find it quickly, and I'll put it in the chat while we're talking here.
Let me say one other thing. Most of what I'm seeing is complex PTSD. In fact, I'm really trying to distinguish complex PTSD from developmental trauma disorder.
I don't think you can.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm heading up the PTSD task force for APA, and we are not distinguishing the two because they are really so closely aligned. So
94% of my guys meet the criteria for antisocial personality, borderline personality. Third would be narcissistic. I'm just convinced all of cluster B is complex PTSD. They're seen as bipolar as children, or as ADHD. No, it's complex PTSD that's being misdiagnosed too often in children.
Yeah.
I'd love to give you some more of my thoughts on that.
Do you have, there was a time when California had conjugal visits in the prisons.
Yes, we still
I would
do.
assume that had to have been stopped during COVID, but I wonder if it's being resumed.
Not yet, but they are working on that. It's complicated trying to bring families together. Right now, they're just having one person be able to visit at a time. They have to be tested when they come in the door on a test before they can come in. They have to test negative. The inmate has to be tested the day before. CDCR is really trying to limit COVID. Yeah, the conjugal visits. Initially, lifers weren't allowed to have them, but the lifers started being able to have conjugal visits. And the guys really missed that. Some of them, their wives have divorced them under COVID because they weren't getting enough attention, enough time with the guys. And the guys are fairly philosophical about that. It's just one more thing that they have to deal with COVID.
Wow. I wish we could go on and on because it's fascinating. Having done a lot of the work in the prisons and in and out of I haven't been in California prisons for a long time, but we just picked up a new case. So that we may end up working with you on this case, depending on how it goes. We're hoping to keep our clients out, but we're not so sure.
Well, in that case, use my private email address.
Exactly.
I've got both
Exactly.
up there, and your private is the Gmail, correct? Will?
Correct, yeah.
Exactly.
They're on the
We
chat.
definitely.
And by the way,
definitely-
we just had another note on the chat. I think Giselle put it in. If there's any more information that you want us to add to the Facebook, Will, either how to contact you, articles, something like that, we can add it also to Facebook so people can find it that way.
Have you published that research, Will? It's fascinating research.
I'm trying to write a book,
Uh-huh.
and I'm trying to stop reading what I need to put in the book to write the book. I wrote a 4-page report that I submitted to the legislature, which does, and the graph or the tables that I had there at the end were part of that. I can certainly send you that. I did write an article for the California Psychologist,
Good.
and honestly, I'd love some feedback from somebody. I wrote a 5,000-page overview of the book, and it's kind of been panned, but I don't think it's so far out of line with what I need to write as an overview, as sort of the introductory chapter to the book.
Oh, Eileen
So-
is an expert in this now.
I was just going to say, Lenore, we know who not to refer him to. Is that right?
Right. We're trying to get a proposal forward and we're having the same problem. So I'm learning to accept rejection, even though I don't like it.
Right. Yeah.
But I
That-
think
the,
it's very important, not just for California, but for legislatures, especially now during the opportunity we might have for criminal justice reform, to see how important treatment in the prison can be, even for those people who have committed horrible crimes or have horrible backgrounds, because otherwise we're just warehousing people, and California is one of the few states, I think, that uses rehabilitation as part of their title instead of just corrections or just detention.
the judge ordered us to put that on there.
I see.
Will, I would just like to say, for those of you who haven't heard, Will's used words like phenomenology and hermeneutic and humanistic. So this is an approach that we taught at Saybrook, and we do come from an existential humanistic perspective in that each person is unique, should be treated with dignity. The relationship or what happens between persons is important. And to apply that, which can sound very lofty, as he's done, to real concrete situations in this case, is really worth writing about and letting people know about.
Absolutely, especially because we know that the warfare between gangs costs their lives, unfortunately. They're the ones who are dying because of the gang wars and the shootings. We have it down here in Miami. Every day we've got new gang killings. They don't say it, but knowing what we know that's what's going on there. And so it's so important because most of the treatment that's been funded by the government is behavioral and behavior modification, as if, yes, that will stop certain behaviors, but it's not going to change the person fundamentally.
That's
And
right.
so it's so important. So we'll help you get it out if we can. We even have a research group that's actually working with people and writing up research. So we might be able to help find people to help them, because
Well,
it's.
I've
we'd love to
researched my
see it.
program myself. I'd much rather have an independent researcher research what I do.
Yeah, well, get money and we'll get you people.
Yeah. Well, that's part of how our research has been tilted towards CBT too, is because the money goes towards CBT.
That's where it's going, exactly, but we have to
I'm not
really.
I'm not opposed to CBT. I just don't think it's the panacea for all ills. I believe it's a
Exactly.
nice set of tools.
Yes, and I
and that-
integrate it in my work, but it's not enough.
Yeah, if I have an inmate in front of me who's spent three decades feeling like he is a piece of shit, I'm not going to be able to switch that thought by saying, I sparkle like gold, or whatever we might switch the thought with. We got to go deeper than that. We have to go into the sense of self. And
Right.
it makes everything else work better.
Patricia, jump in before we end.
Will, thank you so much for your presentation. It touched me so much when I heard you saying that you almost cried when you saw these two prisoners, inmates, talking. And that's so worth it. That a great success in treatment. And if you get at least two being able to talk, that's a lot in prison.
Yeah,
Well,
authentic conversations don't happen in prison.
I am so
And it's-
sorry that we have to end,
Yeah.
but maybe we'll be able to bring you back as well and
But
see how
we're
it's
gonna
going in
practice
another 6
recidivism,
months.
right?
Yeah, see how it's going in
And
another
bring
6
him
months.
back. Yes.
Absolutely. So with that, we're going to sign off for today. Next week, we're going to be back with listening to what's happening in higher education with some of our students, with our graduate students who have been working with us and with residents in Spain. We're going to do a little comparison between what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Spain as well. So we hope we join us then, same time, Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time on COVID IPV or on the International Whole Person Approaches or on Facebook. If you want to join on the Zoom conversation, send us an email. Or post it on Facebook and we'll get you the Zoom line. So with that, have a wonderful week and we'll see you then.
Thank you.